the world is made of two different kinds of silences. There's the kind I lived in, the quiet hum of a respirator in a dimly lit hospital room, the soft rustle of starched scrubs, the held breath before you tell a family there's nothing more you can do. It was a silence of empathy, of shared sorrow, of a life gently ending. Then there was his kind of silence. I didn't know his name then, only the stories whispered in the emergency room by cops who brought in men with unexplained injuries. They spoke of a man called the Ghost, who moved through the city's underworld with a chilling stillness. A man who, at that very moment, stood in a cold, concrete warehouse, his judgment delivered not with a shout, but with a nod. He dealt in a silence of finality, of absolute power, of a life being taken. I was holding the hand of a dying grandmother, whispering that her family loved her, while he was watching a traitor's last breath fog in the frigid air. We were polar opposites, two people inhabiting silences that should never have met. But the universe, in its cruel and chaotic way, was about to shatter both of them with the sound of gunfire. My own life felt like a long, drawn-out sigh. Another 18-hour shift had ended, my feet aching with a familiar, dull throb that radiated all the way up to my soul. The debt from my parents' illnesses was a number seared into my brain, a monstrous figure that dictated every extra shift I took, every simple pleasure I denied myself. I felt invisible, a caregiver used up by the world and left with nothing but the ghosts of the people I couldn't save and the bills for the people I'd already lost. It's a feeling I know many of you might understand, that sensation of giving everything and still feeling like you're drowning. If you've ever felt that way, and if you believe that even the quietest people deserve to have their strength seen, then I hope you'll stick with my story. Your support by subscribing to this channel and sharing this video helps bring more stories like this one to light, reminding us all that we're not alone in our quiet battles. For me, that night, I thought I was completely alone, walking home under the buzzing streetlights, never imagining that the city's loudest scream was about to echo right at my front door. His world had imploded in a hailstorm of shattered glass and hot metal. The ambush was brutally efficient, a testament to a betrayal so deep it had to have come from the inside. Matteo Bellini, a man who never left a single detail to chance, now lay in the back of a black sedan, the fine wool of his suit soaked in his own blood. His right-hand man, Leo, drove with a controlled panic, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning every intersection of the threats. "No hospitals," Matteo rasped, the words costing him more than he could afford. Every hospital was a trap, an easy kill box for his rival, Marco Vescovi, or a cage waiting to be locked by the authorities. His invincibility, the very core of his identity, was bleeding out onto the leather seats. He was the Ghost, a phantom of power and fear, but now he was just a man, drowning in the dark, his carefully constructed empire teetering on the edge of collapse with every ragged breath he took. His only command, whispered through clenched teeth as his vision tunneled, was a desperate, impossible order. Find someone. Someone clean. My apartment was my sanctuary, the only place in the world where I wasn't Nurse Reed, the tireless caregiver, but just Clara. It was small, filled with secondhand books and plants I struggled to keep alive, a testament to my desire to nurture something that wouldn't leave me. The moment I stepped inside and slid the deadbolt home, the city's noise and my own exhaustion seemed to recede. I had a simple routine: tea, a hot shower, and an hour of reading before collapsing into bed. It was a fragile piece, but it was mine. That night, the steam was just beginning to fog the bathroom mirror when the sound ripped through my quiet haven. It wasn't the polite rap of a neighbor or the buzz of a delivery. It was a hard, urgent knock, 3 solid thuds that vibrated through the cheap wood of the door and straight into my bones. It was the kind of knock that doesn't ask for entry, it announces its arrival. My heart seized in my chest. No one ever came to my door this late, no one. I stood frozen, water dripping from my hair onto the worn floorboards, every instinct screaming at me not to open it. My hand trembled as I turned the lock, a stupid, fateful decision born of a lifetime of believing that ignoring a problem wouldn't make it go away. Standing in my dingy hallway was a man who didn't belong there. He was tall, dressed in an expensive suit that was rumpled and stained with something dark near the cuff. He wasn't overtly threatening, but his eyes held a terrifying mix of desperation and authority. This was Leo Gallo, though I didn't know his name. He just looked at me, and his gaze stripped away any illusion of safety I had. "Clara Reed?" he asked, his voice low and steady, but the sound of my name from his lips felt like a violation. I could only nod, my throat too tight to speak. "I'm sorry for this," he said, and the apology was so sincere it was almost more frightening than a threat would have been. "But I need your help. A man is dying." "And you're the only one who can save him." He stepped aside, and in the shadows behind him, I saw another figure slumped against the wall, a ghost of a man held up only by the sheer will of his companion. The metallic, sickeningly sweet smell of blood hit me, and my world tilted on its axis. He was a specter of violence being dragged into my peaceful, ordered life. They brought him inside, and Leo half carried, half lowered the wounded man onto my worn floral rug, the one I'd inherited from my grandmother. Dark crimson blood immediately began to seep into the fibers, a stain that I knew would never come out. The man was unconscious, his face pale as marble, his breathing shallow and ragged. He was dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my car, but it was shredded and soaked through on one side. My fear was a physical thing, a cold knot in my stomach, but years of emergency room training surged forward, a reflex stronger than terror. I dropped to my knees beside him, my fingers automatically going to his neck to check for a pulse. It was there, but it was thready and weak. "He needs a hospital, a surgeon," I stammered, looking up at the man named Leo. "He has multiple gunshot wounds. I can't handle this here." Leo's face was a mask of grim resolve. "There is no hospital," he stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "There's only you. You have to be enough." He saw the war in my eyes, the nurse versus the terrified woman. Leo didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply laid out the terms of my new reality with a chilling precision that told me he knew everything about my quiet desperation. He named the exact figure of my debt, the 6-digit number that was the monster under my bed. $187,452, he said softly. "It's gone, wiped clean, along with enough cash to start over, anywhere you want. A new life, Miss Reed. All you have to do is keep him alive." It wasn't a negotiation. It was a cage crafted from my own misery, and he was holding the key. He was offering me the one thing I dreamed of every single night: freedom. But the price was chaining myself to this man, to his world of violence and death, a world that had just bled all over my floor. I looked from the terrifyingly still man on my rug to the unwavering gaze of his keeper. The door to my apartment was closed, but I knew my life as I knew it, my simple, safe, lonely life, had just ended. I was a hostage to my own hope. My world didn't just crack, it shattered into 1,000 pieces. I survived those 3 days and nights on pure adrenaline, my tiny apartment transformed into a clandestine surgical suite. With trembling hands and knowledge gleaned from years in the ER, I dug 2 bullets out of Matteo Bellini, stitching his torn flesh with sanitized embroidery thread and battling his raging fever with cold compresses and black market antibiotics supplied by Leo. On the 4th morning, they were gone, just like that. Matteo, still pale and weak, but with an unnerving intensity already returning to his eyes, was helped into the pre-dawn darkness. He left behind a blood-soaked rug I could never clean and a thick envelope of cash on my kitchen table, enough to erase my debt and start over a dozen times. The silence they left in their wake was more deafening than any gunshot. I scrubbed the floor until my knuckles bled, trying to erase the ghost of his pain, the memory of his life held precariously in my hands. The money felt tainted, a heavy price for a secret that now isolated me more profoundly than my poverty ever had. I had his blood on my floor and his money on my counter, and I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The fragile illusion of freedom lasted exactly 6 days. I tried to slip back into my old life, to become the invisible, competent Nurse Reed again, but the world felt different, sharper, filled with unseen threats lurking in every shadow. Then the phone call came from hospital administration, a cold, impersonal summons that ended with me sitting in a sterile office, being told my contract was terminated. "An anonymous tip," my supervisor explained, her gaze fixed on a spot just over my shoulder. Allegations of unauthorized medical practice conducted outside of a clinical setting. It's a liability we can't afford. My blood ran cold. It was Marco Vescovi's doing, I knew it instantly. He was hunting for the person who had saved his rival. The dominoes fell with brutal speed after that. An eviction notice, stark and white against my peeling apartment door. Then my parasitic ex-boyfriend Mark reappeared, drawn by the scent of my desperation. He started calling, loitering outside my building, his voice a venomous whisper of threats disguised as offers of help. My sanctuary had become a cage, the city a hunting ground. I was no longer just drowning in debt. I was being actively hunted, my quiet life systematically dismantled, piece by piece. He found me at my absolute lowest, sitting on a park bench as the gray afternoon bled into a dreary evening, the crumbled eviction notice a testament to my complete failure. I was trying to calculate how many double shifts at a greasy spoon diner it would take to afford a week in a grimy motel room when the car appeared. It was a black sedan, so sleek and silent it seemed to tear a hole in reality. It pulled up to the curb, and Leo Gallo emerged, his face as impassive as ever. He didn't speak. He simply held the back door open, and silent, undeniable summons. My body moved on its own, a strange sense of inevitability pulling me from the bench and into the opulent, leather-scented interior. And there he was, Matteo Bellini. He was no longer the broken, bleeding man I had tended to on my floor. He sat upright, composed, dressed in a dark suit that probably cost more than my entire education. The only hint of his near-death experience was a subtle stiffness in his movements. His gaze was fixed on the world outside the tinted window, but his presence was a physical force, a gravitational pull that made the spacious car feel small and airless. "Leo informs me," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble, "that you've encountered some difficulties." I opened my mouth to offer some palatable, watered-down version of the truth, a version that didn't make me sound so pathetic and cornered, but he raised a single hand, a quiet gesture that carried the weight of an unbreakable command. "Don't," he said, his dark eyes finally locking onto mine. In their depths, I saw a chilling intelligence that seemed to strip away all my defenses, seeing right through to the terrified core of me. "I am aware of the situation, all of it." The simple statement sent a shiver down my spine. He knew about my job, the eviction notice, about Mark's predatory return. Leo had been watching me. The realization was a terrifying cocktail of violation and a strange, shameful flicker of relief. He leaned forward just slightly, and the air thickened with the scent of expensive cologne and something else, something uniquely him, the faint metallic tang of his own blood now healed, mixed with the cold scent of power. "Marco Vescovi is a scavenger," he stated, his voice dropping into a register of controlled fury. "He preys on those he perceives as weak. But for him to reach into my world, to touch you, that is an insult that will not go unanswered." The rage was quiet, contained, but it was the most terrifying thing I had ever witnessed. He allowed the chilling promise to settle in the space between us before his tone shifted, becoming coolly transactional. "Your former life is no longer viable," he said, each word a precise, clinical cut. "It has been compromised. Vescovi will not cease his search for the person who saved my life. You are a loose end he feels compelled to eliminate." He was laying out the facts of my new existence with the dispassionate air of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. My life as I knew it was over. "I am providing you with a solution," he continued, the words framed as an offer but delivered as a decree. "I own a property on the coast. It is isolated, fortified, and completely off the grid. You will reside there. You will serve as my personal nurse on a permanent retainer to oversee the final stages of my recovery. In return for this service, you will receive my unequivocal protection. All of your financial concerns will be permanently resolved. Your former boyfriend will cease to be a problem. Vescovi will be dealt with. You will be safe." He was offering me a gilded cage, a beautiful prison built to solve the very problems his presence in my life had created. My pride screamed in protest, but my survival instinct was listening intently. My first visceral reaction was defiance. "I am not your possession," I managed to say, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and outrage. "I saved your life because I'm a nurse. It's my duty. I don't want your money or your protection. I just want my own life back, the one you took from me. For a brief, fleeting moment, a flicker of what looked like respect crossed his stoic features before his mask of indifference snapped back into place. That life is gone, Clara, and the sound of my first name from his lips felt like both a caress and a branding. There is no going back. Do you honestly believe you can fend off a man like Marco Vescovi with your sense of duty? Do you think your ex-boyfriend will respond to reason? They look at your compassion, your innate desire to heal, and they see only a vulnerability to exploit. I see the same thing, but I also see a strength that is worth protecting. He wasn't trying to intimidate me. He was simply presenting the unvarnished, brutal truth of my new reality. He was telling me that my best qualities, the very essence of who I was, had now become my greatest liabilities in this savage world he inhabited. My fear was no longer just of him, but of the terrifying accuracy of his words. He must have seen the war raging in my eyes, the desperate struggle between my foolish pride and my primal need to survive. With a subtle nod, he prompted Leo to hand him a sleek tablet. Mateo's fingers moved across the screen, and then he turned it to face me. The display showed a grainy, black and white security feed of the entrance to my apartment building. A man I'd never seen before was loitering by the door, pretending to read a newspaper, his eyes constantly scanning the street. "One of Vescovi's men," Mateo stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "He has been there for 2 days. He isn't looking for you, not yet. He's waiting for me to return. But his patience will wane. Eventually, he will begin asking questions. And your landlord, your neighbors, your ex-boyfriend,
They are not as loyal as you are." He swiped the screen, revealing a new image, a different camera angle showing Mark, my ex, in conversation with the same loitering man, gesturing animatedly up toward my apartment window. A wave of nausea washed over me. Mark was selling me out. For what? A few $100s to feed his habits? "This is the world you now inhabit, Clara," Mateo said, his voice a low, relentless current. "I am offering you strength. The only other option is to be devoured." I stared at the tablet, at the casual, horrifying betrayal playing out in silent, grainy pixels. All the fight drained out of me, my indignation replaced by a cold, hollow dread that settled deep in my bones. He was right. My stubborn, defiant independence wasn't a virtue. It was a suicide note. I could run, but how far could I get with no money, no job, and no home? Where could I possibly hide that the long, violent reach of Marco Vescovi couldn't find me? I thought of the simple, quiet life I had so fiercely protected, the fragile peace I had built for myself. It was gone, shattered irrevocably the moment they brought their war to my doorstep. Mateo wasn't the one destroying my life. He was merely the one showing me the smoking ruins that were already there. The choice he was giving me wasn't between freedom and captivity. It was between a protected existence and a brutal, certain death. I finally lifted my gaze from the screen to his face. He was watching me, his expression unreadable, his patience absolute. He didn't need to force my hand. He had simply laid out the chessboard and shown me that from the very first move, I had already been in checkmate. My silence was my consent. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the kind you take just before you plunge into freezing water, knowing the shock is coming, but doing it anyway because it's the only way to the other side. "Okay," I whispered, the word feeling flimsy and inadequate, a pathetic whimper of surrender. "I accept." I couldn't bring myself to look at him as I said it. I focused instead on my own hands, clenched so tightly in my lap that my knuckles were white. A profound wave of grief washed over me, a mourning for the ordinary, anonymous woman I had been just a week ago. Clara Reed, the tired but capable nurse, was dead. In her place was this new person, a woman who would live in a gilded cage, her life and her future now irrevocably bound to a man forged from violence and secrets. Mateo gave a single, curt nod, a silent acknowledgement of his victory. "Leo will handle the arrangements," he said, his tone shifting back to one of cool efficiency. "You will not return to your apartment. We will have your personal items retrieved. You are coming with me. Now." The car pulled smoothly away from the curb, and I leaned my head against the cool window, watching the city I once called home blur into a meaningless smear of lights, feeling like a ghost leaving one world to be reborn into his. The coastal estate was less a home and more a beautiful, desolate fortress carved into a cliffside, surrounded by a churning gray sea on one side and an impenetrable forest on the other. It was a world away from my cramped, book-filled apartment, a place of minimalist architecture, cold marble floors, and vast glass walls that seemed to invite the stormy ocean inside. Leo had laid out the rules with polite but unyielding finality. I was not to leave the main house without an escort. All my communications would be monitored, and my only duty was to oversee Mateo's recovery. I was a well-compensated prisoner, my gilded cage furnished with priceless art and a view that stretched to the end of the world. In the first few days, I wandered through the silent, echoing rooms, feeling like a ghost haunting someone else's life. The sterile luxury felt more suffocating than my old life's crushing debt. I had been given everything I thought I wanted: financial security, a reprieve from my exhaustion, but I had lost the one thing that truly mattered: the simple, anonymous freedom of being Clara Reed. Here, I was just a component in his survival, a tool to be used and protected. My first real conversation with Mateo since our flight from the city happened in the estate's library, a cavernous room filled with leather-bound books he had likely never read. He was sitting in a high-backed chair, a glass of water on the table beside him, looking more like the formidable ghost I'd heard whispers about, and less like the bleeding man who had collapsed on my rug. I had come to check his stitches, my professional demeanor a thin shield against his unnerving stillness. "The sutures are healing cleanly," I reported. My voice sounded small in the vast space. "But you're pushing yourself too hard. You need rest." He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the stormy sea outside. "I do not have the luxury of rest," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "And your duties extend beyond my wounds. You will report any change in my condition directly to me, not to Leo. You are my nurse, not his." A spark of my old self, the tired but defiant ER nurse, flared to life. "I am a medical professional, Mr. Bellini," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "My duty is to my patient's health, not to a chain of command." He finally turned his head, his dark eyes meeting mine with a flicker of something I couldn't decipher. Surprise, maybe even a hint of respect. The next afternoon, I found him in the same library, trying to reach a book on a high shelf. He moved with a stiff, pained grace, and a sharp intake of breath betrayed the agony his pride tried to conceal as he stretched his wounded side. He didn't see me standing in the doorway, and for a moment I just watched him, this powerful, feared man, brought low by a simple, human limitation. Before I could think, I walked over, took the heavy volume from his hand, and placed it on the table. "You'll tear your stitches," I said softly, my voice devoid of the sharpness from our last encounter. He didn't thank me, not with words. Instead, he stood there for a long moment, his gaze tracing the lines of my face, as if seeing me for the first time not as a necessity or a complication, but as a person. "It was my father's," he said, his voice quiet, gesturing to the book. He read it every year. It was the first piece of his personal history he had offered, a tiny, fragile crack in the impenetrable armor he wore. In that shared silence, surrounded by the scent of old paper and rain, the air between us shifted, charged with an unspoken understanding that felt more dangerous than any argument. His mother, Isabella Bellini, arrived 2 days later like a queen visiting a remote outpost of her empire. She was an elegant woman in her late 60s, with Mateo's dark, intelligent eyes and a spine made of steel. She moved through the cold, modern house with an air of quiet disapproval, her presence instantly filling the sterile spaces with a weight of history and tradition. Leo treated her with a reverence bordering on fear, and even Mateo's formidable composure seemed to soften, just slightly, in her presence. Her attention turned to me almost immediately. She observed me during dinner, her gaze sharp and analytical, as I explained Mateo's recovery regimen. She didn't ask about my qualifications or my background. Her questions were far more personal, more probing. "You are not afraid of him," she stated later, as we sat alone in the living room, the sound of the crashing waves a constant rhythmic backdrop. It wasn't a question. "He is my patient," I replied, choosing my words carefully. A small, knowing smile touched her lips. "My son has been surrounded by fearful people his entire life, my dear," she said, her voice like soft velvet. "Fear is a currency in his world. I wonder what he will do with someone who refuses to trade in it." The following day,
Isabella found me in the small greenhouse attached to the main house, a place I had adopted as my own little sanctuary. She walked among the plants, her fingers gently touching a leaf here, a petal there, before she stopped beside me. His father was a passionate man, she began, her voice soft and confiding. He loved his family, his life, too openly. He believed love made him strong. His enemies saw it as a weakness to be exploited. They used that love to lure him into a trap. She paused, her eyes distant with a pain that time had clearly not healed. Matteo was there. He saw it all. He learned a different lesson that day. He learned that to protect what you love, you must never let anyone know you love it. He built a fortress around his heart and called it strength. She turned to look at me then, her gaze intense and full of meaning. He does not know how to let anyone in, Clara. He sees kindness as a precursor to betrayal. He is a good man who has forced himself to live in a cold, lonely darkness. Be patient with him. The light hurts his eyes. Her words reframed everything, transforming the monster I feared into a tragic figure, and I hated the pang of sympathy I felt for him. The first sign that our fortress was not inviolable came not with a bang, but with a whisper. Leo brought me a small, crudely wrapped package that had been left at the heavily guarded main gate. There was no sender, no note, just a simple return address, the street number of my old apartment building. My heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Inside the box, nestled in tissue paper, was a single dead blackbird, its wings neatly folded as if in peaceful repose. It was a message, a piece of macabre poetry from the outside world, a clear and chilling statement. We know who you are, we know where you came from. I felt a wave of nausea, the sterile air of the estate suddenly feeling thin and suffocating. I had foolishly started to believe that my old life was a closed chapter, a ghost I had left behind in the city. But this small, dead thing in my hands was proof that my past wasn't gone. It had followed me here, and it was being used as a weapon, a way to get to the man I was now bound to protect. The safety he had promised me was an illusion, and the walls of my gilded cage had just dissolved into mist. Matteo's reaction was a terrifying display of controlled fury. When Leo showed him the dead bird, the warmth that had begun to tentatively bloom between us vanished, replaced by a glacial coldness that was more frightening than any outburst of rage. His face became an unreadable mask of stone, his eyes hardening into chips of obsidian. "Double the patrols," he commanded Leo, his voice lethally quiet. "Sweep the perimeter every hour. No one gets in or out with my direct authorization." He then turned his chilling gaze on me. "You will no longer be permitted in the greenhouse or on the terrace."
You will remain in the main house, in the central wing, at all times. Is that understood? The order was absolute, a steel door slamming shut. I'm not a child, Matteo, I protested, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and indignation. You can't just lock me away. He took a step closer, his presence so immense it seemed to suck the very air from my lungs. This is not a negotiation, Clara, he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Marco Vescovi is not a man who makes idle threats. He sent that bird to you. He is telling me he knows my weakness. And right now, that is you. That night, sleep was an impossibility. His words echoed in my mind. He knows my weakness. That is you. I felt like a liability, a target painted on his back. I wandered into the dark library, drawn by a sliver of light from under the door. I found him standing before the vast window, a silhouette against the moonlit, thrashing sea. He was supposed to be resting, but I knew he hadn't slept since the package arrived. He didn't turn as I entered, but I knew he was aware of my presence. We stood in silence for a long time, the only sound the roaring of the ocean outside, a mirror of the storm inside both of us. I'm sorry, I whispered, the words feeling utterly inadequate. I'm sorry I put you in this position. He finally turned from the window, his face softened by the shadows. You did not put me in this position, he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. You pulled me out of it. He moved closer, and for the first time he initiated a touch that wasn't clinical or accidental. He gently placed his hand on my shoulder, his thumb stroking the fabric of my robe. The simple, protective gesture was a silent confession, an acknowledgement of the fragile, terrifying bond that now existed between us, forged in blood and fear. The illusion of shared solace, however brief,
was shattered the next morning. Leo intercepted another delivery, this one addressed specifically to me under my full name. It was a large manila envelope, and my hands trembled as I opened it under Mateo's watchful, grim gaze. Inside wasn't a note or another dead thing. It was a photograph, a recent one, taken from a distance. It showed the front of my old apartment building, the one I had fled from what felt like a lifetime ago. But it wasn't the building that made my blood run cold. It was what was happening in the picture. Flames were pouring from the windows of my third-floor unit, my home, my sanctuary. Black smoke billowed into the sky, a funeral pyre for the life I once had. Scrawled across the bottom of the photo in thick red ink were 3 words that sealed my fate and bound me to his world forever. You can't hide. The message was no longer a subtle warning aimed at him through me. It was a direct declaration of war against me. I was no longer just the nurse who had saved his life. I was the enemy's primary target. My prison had become the front line, and I was completely, terrifyingly exposed. The photograph lay on the marble countertop, a stark, ugly testament to Marco Vescovi's reach. The image of my burning apartment was a brand on my mind, a declaration that my past was not just gone, but violently erased. In the aftermath, the coastal estate transformed from a gilded cage into a high-security prison. Mateo was a phantom of controlled rage, a storm contained within the walls of his library, his voice a low, lethal current on encrypted phone calls, as he orchestrated a war I couldn't comprehend. I was confined to the central wing, a fragile asset to be protected at all costs. I would watch him through the open library doors, seeing the taut line of his shoulders, the ruthless set of his jaw, and a terrifying, unfamiliar feeling would churn inside me. It was a strange mix of fear for the man he was and a primal sense of safety because his formidable, violent nature was now focused entirely on shielding me. The air grew heavy and still, thick with the certainty that Vescovi's declaration of war was not just a picture, but a promise of the violence that was coming for us next. The first blow came not as an explosion, but as a sudden, suffocating silence. The lights flickered once, twice, then died, plunging the entire estate into an absolute disorienting darkness. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the roar of the ocean outside. Then the backup generators kicked in with a low hum, casting the long corridors in the eerie, sterile glow of emergency lighting. But the illusion of safety was already shattered. A series of sharp, jarring alarms began to blare from the security panel in the main hall. Leo burst into the library where I had been sitting, his usual unflappable calm fractured, a thin sheen of sweat on his brow. "They've breached the outer perimeter," he announced, his voice tight. "West Cliff Path. It's a small team, but they're moving fast. Professionals." Mateo didn't flinch. He rose from his desk with a lethal grace, retrieving a sleek black handgun from a hidden drawer. His dark eyes found mine across the room, and his command was simple, absolute, and chilling. "Stay with me," he said, his voice a low anchor in the chaos. "Do not make a sound." He moved with a predatory stillness, pulling me behind him as he navigated the now unfamiliar landscape of our home. His destination was a section of the library wall that I had always assumed was just solid oak.
With a press of an unseen button, a panel slid open, revealing a dark, narrow opening. He pushed me gently but firmly inside, following right behind me as the heavy door sealed us in. We were in a panic room, a small, cold cube of concrete and steel, the air thick with the scent of metal and dust. The sounds of the assault, distant shouts, the sharp crack of gunfire, the shattering of glass, were muffled, transformed into a dull, terrifying percussion. I was pressed against his back, my hands flat against the hard planes of his muscles. I could feel the steady, calm rhythm of his breathing, a stark contrast to the frantic pounding of my own heart. He was a living shield, a solid wall of warmth and deadly intent between me and the violence that had invaded our sanctuary. His breath was warm against my ear as he whispered, "They won't find this, but if they do, you get down and you do not move from behind me." In the suffocating darkness, with the muffled sounds of war raging outside, the minutes stretched into an eternity. I began to tremble, an uncontrollable reaction to the cold, the fear, and the overwhelming proximity to him. He must have felt the tremors running through my body, because his hand found mine in the blackness, his fingers lacing through my own. His grip was strong, not gentle, but grounding, an anchor in the terrifying storm. "I was in a room like this once before," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp that seemed to be pulled from a deep, wounded place inside him. "The night they killed my father.
His men put me in the wine cellar. I was just a boy. He paused, and I could feel the weight of the memory pressing down on him. I sat there, in the dark, and I listened to it all. The shouting, the gunfire, everything. But the silence after it was all over, that was the worst part. The silence meant he was gone. In that small, cold space, he had given me the key to his entire existence, the piece of his past that had forged the impenetrable man he had become. His confession hung in the air between us, a raw, exposed nerve. The formidable Mafia boss, the ghost, was gone, replaced by the boy who had listened to his father die. My own fears suddenly felt small, selfish. He was sharing the source of his deepest trauma, and in doing so, he was trusting me with a part of himself he had likely never shown another soul. My fingers tightened around his, a silent acknowledgement, an offering of comfort that felt hopelessly inadequate. "The silence I hate," I heard myself whisper, the words tumbling out before I could stop them, "is the one in the hospital room, right after the family has said goodbye and the machines are turned off. It's so absolute, it feels like I failed them." I was comparing my professional grief to his profound, life-altering loss, but he didn't treat it as a lesser pain. In the dim emergency light that flickered on from a small panel, he turned his head just enough to look at me, his eyes dark and intense. "You didn't fail me, Clara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't decipher. "You are the only reason I am not just a silence in a room somewhere." The muffled sounds of combat eventually faded, replaced by an eerie quiet that felt heavier than the gunfire. A moment later, Leo's voice, strained but controlled, crackled through a small hidden speaker in the wall. "Sir, we're clear. They've retreated. We have 2 of them. The others are gone." The heavy door slid open with a soft hiss, flooding our dark sanctuary with the harsh emergency lights of the library. We stepped out, blinking against the sudden brightness, into a scene of utter devastation. The beautiful, ordered room was in ruins, a battlefield of overturned furniture, shattered, priceless vases, and the sharp, acrid smell of gunpowder. The gold, calculating leaders snapped back into place instantly. Mateo's focus shifted, his brief moment of vulnerability encased once more in armor as he assessed the damage, his voice low and clipped as he gave Leo a series of rapid-fire orders. He was the ghost again, but as he moved past me to survey the wreckage, the back of his hand deliberately brushed against mine, a fleeting, electric touch that was a silent acknowledgement of everything that had just passed between us in the dark. Later that night, long after the grim cleanup was complete, and a tense, watchful quiet had descended upon the estate, I found him standing on the windswept terrace. He was a dark silhouette against the turbulent, moonlit sea, ignoring my explicit orders to rest his still healing body. I brought him a glass of water and a small medical kit, my professional duties a convenient excuse to seek him out. He had a shallow gash on his forearm from a piece of flying glass, and he stood perfectly still as I cleaned and bandaged it. Our hands touched, his skin warm against mine, and this time the contact lingered. The air between us was charged, thick with the things we couldn't say. He finally looked at me, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch, stripping away all my carefully constructed defenses. "Vescovi didn't send them to kill me," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp beneath the roar of the waves. "He knows I'm not that easy to kill. He sent them for you. He sent them to prove he could get to you. To prove," he paused, his eyes holding mine, "that he could get to me." He was admitting it. I was no longer just a complication or a responsibility. I was his weakness, the chink in his impenetrable armor. And hearing him say it aloud didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a confession. He lifted his hand, the one that wasn't bandaged, and gently cupped my face, his calloused thumb stroking the line of my jaw. The gesture was a complex language of possession, protection, and an aching tenderness that made my breath catch in my throat. "He will use you to try and break me," Mateo continued, his dark eyes searching mine for any hint of fear or retreat. "He thinks he has found my father's weakness in me. He is wrong." His voice dropped, becoming a low, lethal promise. This ends now. I am done defending. I am going to hunt him down, and I will dismantle his entire world piece by piece. Not for my name, not for my territory, for you. It was a declaration of war, and he had just named me as its entire purpose. I didn't pull away. I leaned into his touch, a silent surrender, and an acceptance of my place at the very center of his violent world. The fear was a cold knot in my stomach, but it was tangled with a fierce, terrifying, and undeniable sense of finally belonging. His declaration of war, waged in my name, was followed by a strange, deceptive calm. For 3 days, the coastal estate was a fortress of tense preparation, but within its walls, a fragile intimacy began to bloom. Mateo was consumed with planning, his calls low and lethal, his focus absolute. Yet he would seek me out. He'd find me in the library and simply sit in silence as I read, his presence a quiet, grounding force. One evening, he insisted I join him for dinner, not as a nurse, but as a companion. We ate a simple meal prepared by the staff, and he spoke not of his war, but of his childhood, of learning to sail with his father in the very sea that now crashed against our walls. He was letting me see past the armor, piece by piece, and I felt myself falling into the beautiful, dangerous depths of the man he was. I allowed myself a foolish, fleeting hope that we could build something real from the wreckage of our lives. That hope was obliterated when Leo entered the dining room, his face a grim mask, interrupting our fragile peace with the news that would send Mateo's world and mine spiraling into chaos. Leo's report was delivered with a clipped military precision that belied the monumental risk it contained. They had received intelligence from a trusted informant, a high-ranking capo, identifying the location of Marco Vescovi's primary distribution hub. It was supposedly undermanned for the next 12 hours, a tactical window of opportunity too perfect to ignore. Mateo's eyes lit with a cold, predatory fire. This was it, the decisive strike that could cripple Vescovi's operations and end the threat to us permanently. A wave of pure dread washed over me, so potent it made me feel dizzy. "You can't go," I pleaded, my voice barely a whisper. "You're not fully healed. Your stitches, it's too soon." He looked at me, and the softness from moments before was gone, replaced by the unyielding steel of the ghost. "This is not your world, Clara," he said, the words a quiet, brutal dismissal of my concern, of my place beside him. "You don't understand the rules. This move doesn't just end the war, it ensures your freedom. I am doing this so you can be safe." He left with Leo and a small team of his most elite men, the heavy oak door closing behind him with a sound of utter finality, leaving me alone in the vast, silent house with nothing but the echo of his promise and the certainty that he was walking directly into a trap. The hours that followed were a masterclass in torment. I paced the cold marble floors of the estate, my body thrumming with a helpless, frantic energy, every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall a hammer blow against my sanity. There was no news, no communication, just a suffocating, absolute silence that felt heavier and more ominous than any gunshot. It was Isabella who finally found me, her regal composure fractured, her dark eyes reflecting a grief so profound it seemed to suck the very air from the room. She didn't speak, she simply held out a sleek tablet, her hand trembling slightly. On the screen, a local news channel was broadcasting live from a chaotic scene of fire and devastation in the city's industrial district. An explosion, the reporter was saying, a suspected gangland war. The camera panned across the smoldering wreckage, and my heart stopped. I saw paramedics loading a bloodied, unmoving figure onto a stretcher. It was Leo. Of Mateo, there was no sign at all. "It was a trap," Isabella whispered, her voice cracking. "The intelligence came from within, from one of our own. He led my son into an ambush, just like they did his father. The traitor had finally shown his hand, and he had used Mateo's desire to protect me as the perfect bait. A tidal wave of guilt, black and suffocating, crashed over me, dragging me under. This was my fault. Every burned piece of metal, every shattered window, the blood soaking Leo's suit. It was all my fault. Vescovi hadn't just set a trap for Mateo, he had crafted it specifically for him, using me as the blueprint. He knew Mateo's love for his father was his original wound, and Vescovy had brilliantly, cruelly created a new one, me. My presence had made the cold, calculating ghost predictable.
My safety had become his singular obsession, a blind spot so enormous that he had walked right into his enemy's snare without his usual caution. I remembered his words on the terrace, heavy with a terrible prophecy. He knows my weakness, and right now, that is you. He had been right. I was a poison in his life, a vulnerability that had now grievously wounded his most loyal friend and had likely cost him his own life. I looked at his mother, her face a stoic mask of agony, and I saw myself for what I truly was, an infection, a foreign body that his world was violently, desperately trying to reject. My protection was a lie. I was the very weapon being used to destroy him from the inside out. He stumbled back into the estate just before dawn, a phantom emerging from a nightmare. He wasn't bleeding, not in the way I knew how to fix, but he was broken in a way that felt far more permanent. His expensive suit was torn and blackened with soot, his face streaked with grime, but it was his eyes that terrified me. They were hollow, empty of everything but a cold, dead rage that seemed to burn from within. He strode past me as if I were invisible, his boots leaving dusty footprints on the pristine marble floor, ignoring my frantic questions about his injuries, about Leo. He went straight to the library and poured a drink, his hand shaking with a fury he could barely contain. When he finally turned to face me, his voice was a shard of ice. "They were waiting for us," he said, his words clipped and devoid of emotion. "They knew our exact approach, our numbers, everything. Vescovy's man, before he died, he laughed. He told me the tip came from someone inside this house, someone who knew every move I was making." He took a step closer, his gaze pinning me in place, a chilling, unbearable weight of suspicion in his eyes. "The only thing that has changed in this fortress, Clara, is you." His accusation, though veiled, struck me with the force of a physical blow, shattering the last fragile remnants of the bond I thought we had built. He didn't trust me. After everything, the blood on my floor, the shared fear in the panic room, the whispered confessions in the dark, his conditioning had won. When faced with the ultimate betrayal, his instincts screamed to blame the emotional variable, the outsider, the weakness. He looked at me and saw not the woman who saved his life, but the potential architect of his downfall. A profound, weary sadness settled over me, so deep it extinguished all my fight. Isabella's warning echoed in my mind. He sees kindness as a precursor to betrayal. He was a man forged in a crucible of suspicion, and I could never be anything more to him than a liability he couldn't afford. In that moment of devastating clarity, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't fight Marco Vescovy. I couldn't unmask a traitor. But I could do the one thing that would truly protect Matteo. I could remove the target from his back. I could disappear, and in doing so, I could give him his strength back by removing his greatest weakness, me. I moved through the silent house like a ghost, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. In the room that had been mine, I left a simple, unsigned note on the perfectly made bed, the words of final, painful surgery to sever our connection. "You were right. I am your weakness. Now I'm gone. Go be strong again." I took nothing with me, not the clothes they had provided, not a single dollar of the money that was promised. I wanted to erase myself completely. I found the service corridor I'd once stumbled upon during a sleepless night, a hidden artery running beneath the opulent skin of the estate. The guards were distracted, their focus on the external threat and the internal hunt for the traitor, and I slipped out into the pre-dawn mist unnoticed. The salt-laced wind felt alien on my skin after weeks of confinement. I walked until I reached the coastal highway, my thumb outstretched, a solitary figure fading back into the anonymous world from which I had been stolen. On a bus heading to a destination I hadn't even chosen, I stared out at the gray, unforgiving landscape, my entire being an aching void of loss. I had done the only thing I could to save him, but in doing so, I had damned myself to a life without him, a hollow existence where the silence was no longer a comfort, but a permanent, crushing sentence. The note I left behind was a ghost haunting the vast, silent estate, but Matteo Bellini did not mourn. He weaponized his grief. Her absence, the sudden, gaping hole in the fabric of his life where her quiet strength had been, did not break him. It focused him with a terrible, glacial clarity. He saw my departure not as a betrayal, but a catastrophic failure on his part, a direct result of the suspicion his father's fate had branded into his soul. That realization ignited a cold, methodical rage. He began to dismantle his own organization from the inside out. His interrogations were whispered and lethal, his surveillance network a tightening dragnet of paranoia and precision. He was no longer just a king defending his territory from an outside threat. He was a man hunting the disease within his own house, driven by the chilling knowledge that every second he wasted was a second I was out in the world, unprotected.
The silence I had left behind was a constant, screaming reminder that he had pushed away the only person who had ever seen the man behind the ghost, and he would burn his entire world to the ground to get her back. I fled not into hiding, but back into the anonymity I had once known, a ghost of a different sort. I found work under a new name at a small, underfunded clinic in a city that felt a world away, burying myself once more in the familiar rhythm of healing strangers. But the peace was a fragile illusion. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every unfamiliar face a potential enemy. It was in the eyes of a young woman named Maria that my old life finally caught up to me. She came in with a broken wrist and a story about falling down the stairs that I had heard 1,000 times before. Her boyfriend was a low-level thug, a man whose casual cruelty was a small-scale echo of the world I had escaped. My instincts, the caregiver's resolve that Matteo had once dismissed as a liability, surged forward. I began documenting her injuries, speaking to her in hushed tones, trying to give her the courage to leave. It was during one of these quiet conversations that I overheard her boyfriend in the waiting room, bragging on the phone to his crew about a new boss moving into the territory, a man with deep pockets and a reputation for ruthlessness. His name was Marco Vescovi. My blood ran cold. My past hadn't just followed me, it was actively colonizing my present. Back at the coastal fortress, the hunt for the traitor reached its violent conclusion. It wasn't a disgruntled soldier or an ambitious rival, but Lorenzo, his father's most trusted advisor, a man who had been a fixture in Matteo's life since childhood. Cornered in the library, surrounded by the ghosts of a loyalty he had long since sold, Lorenzo confessed. Vescovi had preyed on his gambling debts, twisting his desperation into a weapon against the son of the man he once served. But the most chilling revelation was not the mechanics of the betrayal, but its motive. Vescovi's ultimate goal was not just territory, it was psychological annihilation. He had become obsessed with me, not as a person, but as a symbol. Lorenzo revealed that Vescovi had put a staggering bounty on my head, circulating my description to every low-life criminal in the country, seeking not my death, but my capture. He wanted to parade me in front of Matteo as living proof that love was a fatal flaw. Matteo listened to the confession with an unnerving stillness, the cold fury in his eyes solidifying into a diamond-hard certainty. My act of self-sacrifice, my attempt to save him by disappearing, had been a catastrophic miscalculation. I hadn't removed his weakness, I had simply let it wander out of the fortress and into the wolf's den. The two worlds, his and mine, were now on a collision course, drawn together by the magnetic pull of Vescovi's obsession. At the clinic, I finally convinced Maria to leave her abuser, her terror momentarily eclipsed by a flicker of hope. We were stuffing her meager belongings into a duffel bag in a back room when he burst in, his face a mask of possessive rage. But his anger at Maria was quickly overshadowed by a dawning, greedy recognition in his eyes as he looked at me. "I know you," he sneered, pulling out his phone to compare my face to the picture that had been circulating in the underworld. "You're Bellini's nurse. The bounty on you will set me up for life." My heart hammered against my ribs as he made the call, his words sealing my fate. At that very moment, hundreds of miles away, Matteo's own intelligence network lit up. The traitor's confession had given him Vescovi's communication patterns, and a sudden, high-priority call originating from a burner phone near a clinic in a nondescript city tripped every alarm. He didn't need confirmation. He knew. He was already moving, a silent, avenging storm closing in on the dingy building where my desperate attempt at a new life was about to come to a violent, bloody end. Marco Vescovi arrived not with an army, but with the smug confidence of a man who had already won the war.
He stood in the sterile hallway of the clinic, his expensive suit a jarring slash of darkness against the peeling paint, his smile a portrait of sadistic triumph. He saw me not as a threat, but as his trophy, the final piece in his elaborate game to psychologically dismantle his rival. He built a fortress of ice around himself after his father died, Vescovy mused, his voice dripping with condescension, as his men held me fast. And then you, a little stray, wandered in and melted it all. He should thank me. I'm just teaching him the family lesson one more time. Even then, pinned and powerless, I refused to be a passive pawn. I kept talking to Maria, trying to calm her, my voice steady, my nurse's instincts a stubborn refusal to surrender my identity. As Vescovy reached for me, a flicker of movement outside the grimy window was the only warning before chaos erupted. The attack was not a firefight. It was a ghost's work, silent and brutally efficient. And then he was there, Matteo. He moved through the wreckage, his eyes ignoring everyone until they found mine. Vescovy, recovering his composure, grabbed me, pressing a cold barrel to my temple. "The choice is yours, Bellini," he hissed. "Your empire or her."
A king or a fool. In that moment, suspended between life and death, Matteo Bellini made a choice that destroyed the man he was and forged the man he was meant to be. Without hesitation, he let his own weapon clatter to the floor, his hands raised in a gesture of complete and utter surrender that stunned every person in the room. "The war is over, Marco," he said, his voice quiet but absolute, a vow that echoed in the sudden silence. "Let her go. It's me you want." He was offering his life, his legacy, everything his father's death had taught him to protect, laying it all at the feet of his enemy for my sake. It was the ultimate act of vulnerability, and it was the most powerful thing I had ever seen. Vescovy, momentarily bewildered by this impossible move, loosened his grip on my arm by a fraction of an inch. It was all I needed. I drove my heel down on his expensive shoe and slammed a nearby metal tray into his face. The clang of metal on bone was the signal. A single precise shot from Leo's position by the door sent Vescovy's gun skittering across the floor. In the chaotic aftermath, Matteo bypassed his fallen rival entirely, his world shrinking until it contained only me. He pulled me into his arms, his touch not one of possession, but of desperate, grounding relief. "You are not my weakness, Clara," he whispered into my hair, his voice thick with emotion. "You are my strength." And as I leaned into him, I knew I was finally home. In the months that followed, the silence of our world changed once again. It was no longer the tense, watchful quiet of a fortress under siege, but the calm, steady hum of a life being rebuilt. Matteo moved with a surgical precision I recognized, but it was aimed not at destruction, but at cauterizing the wounds within his own organization. Vescovy's empire was a ghost, its assets seized or absorbed, its power dismantled so completely it was as if it had never existed. The traitor, Lorenzo, was gone, a footnote in a history that Matteo was determined not to repeat. My own role shifted from a protected asset to an active partner. With Matteo's backing, I established a foundation that funded small, under-the-radar clinics like the one where he'd found me, creating safe havens for women like Maria, who was now living in a new city under a new name, her future her own. The coastal estate, once my gilded cage, slowly became a home. I filled its sterile spaces with life, with books and the scent of baking bread, transforming it from a monument to his father's tragic lesson into a testament to our own story of survival and second chances. The library, once the nerve center of his war, became our sanctuary. The vast table where he had planned his counterattack was now where we ate breakfast, the morning sun streaming through the bulletproof glass. One evening, I found him staring at the scar on his side, a faint silvery line against his skin. I traced it with my finger, the gesture no longer clinical, but intimate. "It's a part of our story," I whispered. He covered my hand with his touch gentle. "It's the part where my story truly began," he corrected me, his voice low and certain. He was a different man, or perhaps the man he was always meant to be. The cold, calculating ghost still existed. I saw him in the shrewdness of his business dealings, in the unwavering loyalty he commanded. But with me, in the quiet moments, he was just Matteo. He was learning a new language, one of shared laughter and easy silence, and I was learning to trust that his strength was not a wall to keep the world out, but a shield to keep our world safe. The number of my old debt, once a monster that haunted my every waking thought, was now a forgotten ghost, a relic from a life that no longer felt like mine. His world was still dangerous, a landscape of shifting alliances and hidden threats, but he no longer navigated it alone. He began to ask for my opinion, not on matters of violence or strategy, but on people. He valued my ability to see past the masks, to read the quiet desperation or hidden kindness in a person's eyes. "You have a different kind of sight, Clara," he told me once, as we reviewed the plans for a new community center his foundation was building. "You see the cracks. I only ever learned to see the threats."
In that, I understood the true nature of our partnership. He was the unbreakable wall, and I was the one who could see the fractures, not as weaknesses, but as places where the light could get in. I was no longer just the nurse who had saved his life. I was the compass that was helping him navigate a new moral landscape, where power was used not just to protect, but to heal. He was dismantling the fortress around his heart, brick by brick by brick, and he was letting me help him build a home in its place, where vulnerability was not a prelude to betrayal, but the very foundation of trust. We were standing on the terrace one evening, the sky a soft canvas of twilight colors, watching the sea that had once felt so menacing. Now its rhythmic crash against the cliffs was a soothing lullaby, a constant reminder of the storms we had weathered together. He turned to me, his dark eyes reflecting the fading light, and in their depths I saw none of the coldness that had once terrified me. I saw only a profound, unwavering peace. He didn't offer me a ring or make a grand declaration. He simply took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine, and said,
This is the only thing that's real. And I knew he was right. Our beginning was forged in violence and fear, a collision of two worlds that should never have met. But from the wreckage, we had built this quiet harbor. We had found in each other not a savior or a weakness, but a partner. The world is made of many different kinds of silence, but ours was now the best kind, the one where no words are needed, because you are finally, completely, and safely home. If our story of finding strength in the most unexpected places has touched you, I hope you'll share it, so that others might also believe in the power of a second chance.